Pack your tools, Marcus. We don't need dead weight around here anymore. This isn't your company anymore, Weston said loud enough for the whole floor. I stood there in my own safety glasses, in the building I'd personally paid to heat for 22 winters, holding my father's old calipers. 6 machinists I had trained myself watched me get walked out of Riley Precision Machining by a man who'd never once operated a lathe. Weston Calloway didn't know it yet, but he had just fired me from a building he did not and would never actually own. I want you to understand that part first, because it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you tonight, honestly. Now, I know exactly what you think this story is going to become: a bitter ex-husband, a revenge plot, a courtroom takedown. That's not what this is. This is a story about what happens when arrogance forgets to check whose name is actually on the deed. I'll be honest, there is a building involved, and I'll get to every square foot of it, but the humiliation was never really about property. What Weston stole from me that morning wasn't a paycheck. It was 22 years of quietly believing I no longer mattered in my own life. Studies from the National Federation of Independent Business found that roughly half of small business owners experience at least one divorce during their working lives. I was exactly that statistic, and for 3 years, I let that statistic convince me I had lost absolutely everything I ever built. So here's the one thing I'll ask you before I tell you the rest, because these stories always seem to ask something first. If you've ever been pushed out of something you built with your own hands and told it was never really yours, subscribe. Because this is a story about how easily people mistake control of a room for ownership of the ground it's actually standing on. My name is Marcus Riley. I'm 49 years old, and I started a machine shop in Canton, Ohio in 1998 with $12,000. I graduated from Timken Vocational High School in 1994, 4 years before I ever touched my father's savings for that first lathe. That $12,000 was every cent my father left me when he died, along with his old set of precision calipers. My father, Daniel Riley, worked 31 years at Timken Company himself, and he taught me to read a micrometer before I learned to drive. I rented a small building on Cherry Avenue that first year, 3,000 square feet, 1 lathe, and a landlord who barely believed I'd last. The building on Cherry Avenue had been a bicycle repair shop before I rented it, and the landlord thought I'd fold within a year. I married Denise in 2001. She handled the books, the invoices, and the payroll while I ran the floor and learned to weld properly. Denise and I met at a church potluck in 1999, and she balanced my first year of invoices at our kitchen table by hand. By 2015, Riley Precision Machining had 11 employees, steady contracts with 2 regional auto suppliers, and enough profit to finally buy our building outright. Studies estimate that between 43 and 48% of entrepreneurs experience divorce, a rate significantly higher than the general American population overall. I never once thought that statistic would apply to me, the way you never think any statistic will apply to you personally. By 2010, we had 5 employees, a real payroll system, and enough steady work that I finally stopped worrying about making rent. My accountant, a careful man named Harold Ostrowski, told me something that year I didn't fully appreciate until 3 long years later. Harold Ostrowski had done my taxes since 2003, a quiet, careful man who rarely spoke unless he genuinely had something worth saying. I remember laughing when he first suggested the holding company, telling him I didn't need that much complexity for one small shop. He just shrugged and said, "Humor me, Marcus. Paperwork is cheap insurance for problems you honestly can't see coming yet at all." He said, "Don't put the real estate in the company name, Marcus. Put the building in a separate holding company just in case." I formed Riley Property Holdings LLC that same year solely in my own name, and the deed to our building went into it. It felt like paperwork at the time, a formality Harold insisted on, not a decision that would matter to anyone for years. Weston Calloway first walked into our shop in 2017, wearing a suit that cost more than my truck, talking about growth capital. I liked him at first, honestly, the way you like anyone who seems genuinely excited about something you built with your own hands. In 2018, Denise started spending long hours with a client named Weston Calloway, a private equity investor who'd put capital into our expansion. Looking back now, I think Denise liked him for reasons that had very little to do with our machine shop at all. I found out about the affair the way most people do. A phone left unlocked on the counter, and I didn't fight for the marriage. The affair lasted 8 months before I found it, though I still don't fully know exactly when it actually began between them. The divorce, finalized in 2019, split what the lawyers called the business, meaning the operating company, its contracts, its equipment, its goodwill. Denise's attorney argued she was a co-founder for tax purposes, and I was too exhausted by then to fight over machinery and invoices. I didn't hire a divorce attorney who specialized in business valuations because I didn't think I could afford one at the time. Denise's attorney, a sharp woman from Akron named Priscilla Vantel, built the entire case around the operating company's contracts and its equipment. I let her have 55% of Riley Precision Machining LLC, believing, the way you believe things while grieving, that I'd lost my life's work. Nobody's attorney, not hers, not mine, ever asked a single question about Riley Property Holdings LLC, the entity that actually owned our building. My own attorney, a general practice lawyer named Roger Feeney, never once asked about the property records at the county recorder's office. I signed the settlement in November of 2019, in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee without reading every page carefully. I stayed on afterward as a machinist, not an owner, because the work was the only part of my life that still made sense. For 3 years after that, I told myself the machine shop simply wasn't mine anymore, full stop, no further questions ever needed. I kept my father's calipers in my own toolbox the entire time, the one thing from before that nobody could touch or claim. I told myself I stayed for the craft, for the 6 guys I'd trained, for the hum of the machines I still loved. Denise married Weston in 2021, and he began showing up at the shop more, first as an investor, then quietly as its actual operator. He renamed nothing, changed nothing about the sign out front, but everyone on that floor understood within a year who was really in charge now. Weston's capital expanded the shop to 14 employees by 2022, adding 2 new CNC machines I had personally recommended years earlier myself. I watched a man who'd never worn a respirator make decisions about tolerances and tooling that I had spent 22 years learning to get right. I watched newer, younger machinists get promoted past me, and I quietly told myself that was simply how things worked around here now. I said very little, because by then I had built an entire identity around being the guy who used to own this place. That's the wound, if I'm honest with you, believing that losing the company meant losing the right to matter inside my own building. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, Weston walked onto the floor and told me, in front of everyone, that my services weren't needed. He called it a restructuring. He called me dead weight. He did not, at any point, mention the building we were standing inside. The morning I got fired, Weston used the word restructuring 3 separate times, like repetition alone might make it feel less personal. I didn't argue. I picked up my box, said goodbye to the men still watching, and walked out the same door I'd installed in 1998. I drove home that afternoon, sat in my truck in my own driveway, and genuinely believed I had nothing left to show for 22 years. 2 days later, Harold Ostrowski called me, the same accountant who'd insisted on that holding company back in 2015, sounding oddly urgent on the phone. Harold's phone call 2 days later came at 4:47 in the afternoon, and I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen. "Marcus," he said, "did anyone at Riley Precision Machining ever tell you the commercial lease on Cherry Avenue is up for renewal next month?" I sat down. I always trusted Harold's instincts, even when I didn't fully understand what he was carefully building toward on the phone. I told him no, because nobody had told me anything since I got walked out with a box of my father's old tools. I asked him to walk me through it slowly, because none of this had fully registered yet in my exhausted, confused mind. "That lease," Harold said, "is between the operating company and Riley Property Holdings LLC, and you're still the sole owner of the second one." When he finished explaining the lease situation, I sat in silence for almost a full minute before I could say anything back. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked him, and he said honestly, "I assume someone in that divorce had already told you." I drafted the lease renewal letter myself that weekend, with Harold's guidance, keeping the tone calm, professional, and entirely without any threats. I sat there in my kitchen holding the phone, slowly understanding Weston had just fired the one person who still legally owned that ground. Harold pulled the original paperwork from 2015, the deed, the LLC formation documents, and the lease agreement nobody had bothered updating in 6 years. I've thought a lot since then about how close I came to never checking, to simply letting 3 lost years become my whole story. Every signature was mine. Every dollar of property tax for 9 straight years had come out of an account only I controlled. Denise's 55% bought her the machines, the contracts, the name on the door, and absolutely none of the 4 walls surrounding any of it. I asked Harold why nobody, not one lawyer, not one accountant on either side, had ever flagged this during the entire divorce process. Because everyone was fighting over the business, he said, and nobody ever asks who actually owns the dirt underneath a fight like that. Researchers who study divorce and family businesses have noted that real estate held separately from an operating company is frequently overlooked during settlement negotiations. That single boring formality from 2015 was quietly worth more than every angry word spoken during that entire divorce proceeding combined, honestly. That oversight, in my case, meant I still held every legal right to the one thing Weston needed most to keep his new company running. I did not call a lawyer to threaten eviction. I did not call Denise to gloat about what her new husband had missed. I called Harold back and asked him, calmly, to draft a formal notice about the upcoming lease renewal on Cherry Avenue itself. I want to tell you honestly that some small, wounded part of me wanted to shut the doors and watch them scramble for a building. I didn't do that, and I need to explain exactly why, because I think it matters more than any leverage itself, honestly. 6 people still work on that floor, people I personally hired, people I trained myself, people with mortgages and kids in daycare. Shutting down that lease out of spite would have hurt them exactly as much as Weston, and none of them had done anything wrong. So instead, I asked Harold to schedule a meeting, not a confrontation, a straightforward business meeting about the terms of a lease renewal. Weston walked into that conference room expecting, I think, a landlord he could simply outnegotiate the way he'd outnegotiated smaller deals before. He did not expect the landlord across the table to be the machinist he had walked out 3 weeks earlier with a box of tools. I watched his expression change slowly, the same practiced composure he'd worn on the shop floor cracking just slightly at the edges. "This building," I said, "has been in Riley Property Holdings LLC since 2015. My name, my signature, my property taxes for 9 years." Denise, who had come along, went very quiet, staring hard at documents she apparently hadn't seen since the divorce settlement was finalized. "You fired me," I said, "from a floor I still legally own, in a building neither of you ever actually held title to." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The paperwork on that table did the only talking that mattered. Weston tried, briefly, to argue the lease had implied protections, that continuous operation created some informal right to remain regardless of the deed. Harold, sitting beside me, calmly explained that a written commercial lease, expiring in 31 days, does not work that way under Ohio law. I offered them a new 5-year lease at a fair market rate, adjusted honestly for the current commercial rents on Cherry Avenue. I did not inflate the number to punish them. I did not attach conditions designed to humiliate anyone sitting in that room. I am not going to pretend I didn't enjoy watching Weston realize, in real time, exactly how much he had underestimated the man he fired. But I want to tell you why I chose fair terms instead of leverage, because that choice is the actual point of this story. Being underestimated is not the same thing as being weak, and proving that doesn't require becoming cruel to the people who underestimated you. Denise asked to speak with me privately after the meeting, in the hallway outside Harold's office, her voice smaller than I remembered it. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "about the building. Nobody ever told me the holding company was still just yours after everything." I told her I believed her, because I don't think Denise ever set out to steal something she didn't even know existed. I told her the real failure was that both our lawyers spent 2 years fighting over machines and never once asked about the ground. I signed the new lease 3 days later with modest but fair terms, and Riley Precision Machining kept its doors open on Cherry Avenue. Weston did not offer me my old job back, and honestly, I didn't want it, not the way things had become between us. What I wanted, and what I finally got, was something quieter than revenge, the simple, documented truth of who actually built and owned that place. I've since started a smaller shop 2 miles away, Riley Custom Fabrication, on land I bought outright with my own name on it. 3 of my old employees came with me within the first month, the 2 who'd known me longest and 1 apprentice I'd trained from scratch. I am not going to fight Weston or Denise for the original company's name, its contracts, or its remaining reputation in this town. I want to tell you honestly why, because I think restraint only means something if you explain the reasoning behind it clearly. Fighting them for the name would keep me tied to a version of my life I've already decided to stop carrying around. I got the one thing neither of them can ever take from me now, which is proof, permanent and recorded, of who built that floor. No lawyer, no ex-wife, no confident new husband can argue with a deed filed at the Stark County Recorder's Office since March of 2015. I used to think losing the company meant I'd lost the right to call any of it mine, that ownership only counted on paper. I know now that quiet, documented proof outlasts loud confidence every single time, even when nobody in the room remembers to check it. Weston walked me out of that building believing control of the floor meant he controlled everything standing on it, including me, apparently. He was exactly backward about that, the same way I had been backward about my own worth for 3 quiet, grieving years. I don't say this to excuse how small I let myself feel walking out of my own shop with a cardboard box of tools. I say it because understanding where that smallness actually came from doesn't erase the years, it just finally gives them a shape. If I could go back and tell the Marcus standing in that parking lot one thing, I'd tell him to call Harold sooner. Not out of revenge, but because the ground he was standing on the entire time was still legally, quietly, completely his own. I make these videos for people who've let someone else's confidence convince them they no longer own the thing they actually built. So here's my question for you tonight, the one I've been sitting with since that Tuesday morning on the shop floor, honestly. Is there something in your own life someone confidently walked you out of, without ever once checking whose name was actually on it? Don't tell me the whole story if you're not ready to. Just tell me in the comments what that thing was for you. Because I almost let one humiliating morning convince me of something the paperwork in a filing cabinet had already proven false for 9 years. If this story reached you, if you've ever been made to feel small in a place you actually built, subscribe and stay a while. I'll keep making these for the people who've been quietly underestimated, because a phone call from an accountant taught me mine was never true. Riley Custom Fabrication is small right now. 8 employees, 1 building, a fair lease with my own name on both sides of it. I am not angry at Denise anymore, not really, and I've stopped needing Weston to apologize for something he never understood he'd done. I am grateful, honestly, for Harold Ostrowski, a careful accountant who insisted on a boring formality back in 2015 nobody thought would ever matter. That boring formality turned out to be the only thing standing between 22 years of my work and losing it entirely to someone else's confidence. I visit the old building sometimes, just to see the machines still running, the lease payments landing in my account every single month quietly. I don't go inside anymore. I don't need to. I already know exactly whose name is filed at the county recorder's office. That's the part I think about most now, that a piece of paper filed 9 years ago outlasted a marriage and a small man's pride. Weston got the company name, the contracts, and Denise. I got the deed, the truth, and every dollar of quiet vindication that came with it. That kind of proof doesn't need to shout. It just needs to sit quietly in a filing cabinet until somebody finally asks the right question. I told Harold last week I finally understood what he meant back in 2015, that boring paperwork is sometimes just love wearing a different name. He laughed and said he'd just been doing his job, but I think some part of him always knew that deed would matter someday. Being underestimated, I've learned the hard way at 49, is not the same thing as being weak, no matter how loudly someone insists otherwise. Sometimes the quietest, most boring document in a filing cabinet outlasts every confident, cruel sentence spoken across a shop floor eventually, quietly. I am not going to pretend the humiliation of that Tuesday morning didn't happen or that it didn't cost me something real. But I am going to tell you that it wasn't the ending it felt like, it was simply the moment before the actual truth arrived. Thank you for staying with me through all of this tonight. My name is Marcus Riley, and I still own the ground I stand on. The company they took from me was never really the point, the deed was, and now, finally, so is the quiet life I've built.